Tonight we continue our study of the human brain, examining one of its most devastating diseases, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a complex mental disorder marked by disturbances of perception, cognition, emotions, and motor behaviors. Its symptoms vary from delusions and hallucinations to disorganized thoughts or behavior. Despite years of intense study, the origins and development of schizophrenia remains a mystery. We cannot recognize it in physical features of the brain in the same way. For example, we know plaques and tangles that show Alzheimer's. We also don't know exactly what causes it, though it's believed to be a combination of genetic and environmental factors. What is certain is the disease's devastating effects. It is estimated that 1% of Americans suffer from schizophrenia. It usually strikes in late adolescence or early adulthood without regard to class, race, gender, or culture. Everyone from the writer Jack Kerouac and the musician Brian Wilson and Nobel Prize winner John Nash have fought the disease of schizophrenia, yet the lack of understanding about it has led many to hide their diagnosis. More recently, though, some patients have begun to speak publicly about their experiences. Danny Hurley is one of them. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia while a student at Georgia Tech. He joins me this evening to share his story and his insights on the disease. Also joining me tonight, a remarkable group of scientists. Stephen Paul is director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Institute and a professor at Weill Cornell Medical College. Cornelia Bargmann is the Torsten N. Weisel Professor at Rockefeller University. Judith Rapoport is chief of the Child Psychiatry Branch at the National Institute of Mental Health. David Lewis is a professor of Translational Neuroscience and chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh. And once again, my esteemed co-host is Dr. Eric Kandel, a Nobel laureate, a professor at Columbia, and a Howard Hughes medical investigator. So tell me where we are today. What are we going to find out on this journey?
We're going to speak about psychiatric illnesses today. In the last few programs, we spoke about neurological illnesses, disorders of consciousness, of cognition. Today, we're going to speak about psychiatric illnesses, and we're going to speak about the most devastating of all psychiatric illnesses, schizophrenia. And we have Danny Hurley here, who can tell us what it's like to actually experience the disease. The disease is tragic from several points of view. First of all, it's fairly common. 1% of the population worldwide suffers from schizophrenia. Two, the disease affects people early in their lives and often is non-remitting, so it's with them for the rest of their life. So it really affects people in a very dramatic way. We've known about schizophrenia for a very long time, but we've had very little scientific understanding of it. So Hippocrates already spoke about psychotic illnesses, but it wasn't really until the beginning of the 20th century that we began to make sense out of it. People didn't know how many different psychiatric illnesses were there. Were all psychotic illnesses subcategories of one, or were there many different ones? And Emil Kraepelin, our first hero, was the one who began to put psychiatry on a scientific basis. He said, we must make diagnoses like they make in other areas of medicine. In the absence of biological markers, you can use aspects of the clinical history to help you. You can see what are the nature of the symptoms the disease has, what's the course of the disease over time, and what's the final outcome. And when he looked at psychotic illnesses from that point of view, which he focused on, he found he could divide them into two major groups: disorders of thought and disorders of mood. He called disorders of thought dementia precox. And he called it precox, that is, dementia early in life, because he said it's very different in senile dementia, Alzheimer's disease, because this starts much earlier. But it's similar to Alzheimer's disease in the sense that the cognitive symptoms are the prominent features of the disease, and they carry throughout the life of the patient, and it's non-remitting. He called disorders of mood manic depressive disorders, and he saw that they're very different. The major symptoms were feeling terrifically good, hyper euphoric, or feeling sad. That unlike schizophrenia, there were remissions in which people really functioned quite well, and often, although not invariably, the outcome was good. The distinction between these two major psychotic disorders, although there's overlap, has carried forth to this day. We still practice Kraepelinian psychiatry. So he's the scientific founder of the field. However, a number of people, particularly Eugene Bleuler, objected to the conception of dementia precox. And they objected for many reasons. One is they thought that dementia was only one component of the disease. It was not exclusively a cognitive deficit, number one. Number two, Bleuler said he saw patients who developed the disease later in life, not necessarily early. And he saw a number of patients who did well with the disease after many years. And Danny, of course, is a perfect example of this. And he called the disease schizophrenia. He saw it as a splitting of the mind, as a splitting off of the feeling aspect from the cognitive aspect, from the motivational aspect of the disease. And this has become really very fundamental to understanding of the disease, and most of us accept that definition of the disease as the one we work with. Tragically, although we began to understand the disease, there was really no effective chemical treatment. And then a fascinating story developed. Paul Charpentier, a French chemist, began to develop an antihistaminic compound that turned out to be useful in the treatment of schizophrenia. And this was a complete accident. And a number of drugs that were developed in the early phases of developing a psychopharmacology, treatments for psychiatric disorders, came out serendipitously. Ron Poulenc, the company he worked for, was the first company to discover antihistaminics, and realizing that these are very good for allergic diseases. But the trouble with the early antihistaminics that they developed is they had a lot of side effects. So they asked Carpentier to develop better antihistaminics with fewer side effects. And he came up with a drug called Thorazine that had fewer side effects. And as it went into clinical trials, people were amazed at how calm the patients were. They were much more relaxed than they had been before. And Delay and Deniker, two very astute French psychiatrists, noticed that if psychotic patients, particularly schizophrenic patients, took it, it was like a magic bullet. They stopped hallucinating, they stopped having delusions. It made a fantastic impact. It came to the United States within a short period of time. The FDA approved it. And by 1954, this was introduced in the 1950s, by 1954, 2 million people had tried this. And this was one of the major reasons why so many of the state hospitals were emptied out. Now, in the early days, we really didn't have a scientific understanding of the nature of schizophrenia. And so these first drugs were not only developed serendipitously, but the second generation was based upon trying to improve what was there in the first generation. It was really empirical instead of having a profound understanding of the disease. But now, as you learned, we're really beginning to understand the beginnings of a scientific base of schizophrenia. And therefore, the hope is we'll develop a whole new range of drugs that are based on the mechanism of the disease rather than imitation of the previous generation of drugs. So we're going to learn a lot about where psychiatry is and where it's going as a result of this discussion today.
I'm always interested in this sort of last question I always ask, which is sort of, if there's, what would be the breakthrough that you hope to see? What would be the one thing that, one question you would like to see answered?
I think to get from my perspective, to have a neural circuitry basis for understanding the disease process of schizophrenia. That is, at the level of cells and the molecules within those cells that are the substrate for brain functions like working memory that are disturbed in the illness, what is actually the biological basis there.
And how close do you think we are to finding that?
Well, closer than we were before. But, you know, I think one of the challenges in schizophrenia is not only the disease so complex, but the organ that's affected is...
And the component of the organ.
Yeah, exactly.
These are the highest mental processes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think that understanding where things go wrong in a common pathway very early in brain development, if we understood the mechanisms, we might end up with a kind of statin that would be preventive for many different disorders. That's my vision.
Charlie, I think understanding the genetic as well as the non-genetic factors that cause the disease would be the breakthrough that we need. Remember, as Corey mentioned, even if you inherit the identical DNA from your twin, that has schizophrenia, you only have a 50% chance of getting schizophrenia. So there's some powerful modifying effects, either of the environment or other genes or who knows. If we could understand that, I think we'd be able to craft much better treatments.
I think it would be positive to have a national discourse about schizophrenia, similar to what we have with autism and breast cancer, and I think it would be a step in the right direction to solving many of these problems.
Why has autism risen to such intense concern, and
because
schizophrenia
there is
hasn't?
the feeling that it's increasing in its incidence. Some of this may be real, some of it imagined. It was not known to exist as a disease until the 1940s, and the diagnosis has increased dramatically in the last 10 years. This is for a variety of reasons. There are various services that are available to kids with autism, so that diagnosis is often put on them in order to make services available. But there may be an actual increase in incidence.
That's a statistical observation you can make, isn't it?
Yes, yes, yes.
Roy, what question do you most want to see answered here? What I assume is a genetic
Well,
one.
you know, no one could be more interested in and committed to the idea of using basic science and genetics and animals to study diseases than I am. And I do believe that we'll get rewards from that. But I also think partnerships between the patients and the scientists and the doctors are going to be a place where big advances are made, that really drawing in everyone who's affected as collaborators is going to be really important.
It's probably a uniquely human disease when it's
Absolutely.
all said and done.
Absolutely.
And that's
this
why
is
the
why
patient's so
certain kinds of
important.
psychotherapy might be effective.
Yep.
Let me just say, Danny, how good it is to have you here. When Eric conceived this idea for a series in terms of, and we basically, he had the notion that it would be so helpful and so constructive, we thought, to have from the experience of someone who was living with a disease to come to this table. And it takes, I think, an element of courage, and it takes an element of wanting to make a contribution. So you are exactly what we had in mind when this series was conceived. So if your friends ask, why are you on the Charlie Rose Show? You tell them because we need you.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you.